Today we will be addressing one of the most important issues of our time. What religion are the Minecraft Illagers? Or more specifically, what real-world religion most closely aligns with the religion we see of the Minecraft Illagers? There's of course a myriad of different things that are going to affect this decision, and we're going to go through each one of these things, point out what each aspect of it could affect the religion, and then figure out what religion in the real world most accurately represents what we see in game. So we're going to start off with the actual Illagers themselves. Specifically, we're going to focus on the Evoker, because the Evoker has the most clear religious impact of all three of the Illager types. Now, of course, the Illager has a couple of attacks, and that's where we're going to start with this guy. His first ability is to summon the Vex. Now, Vex are a little bit interesting, but let's take one step back and look at the name for the Evoker. In the actual game files, he is known as the Evocation Illager. Evocation, by definition, is the action of invoking a spirit or deity. Now, what spirit are they invoking? Well, that's quite clearly the Vex. Now, the question is, what are the Vex? Well, the Vex seem to be something similar to a pixie, which is based on Victorian era England mythology, but more specifically, these are based off of fays. So it seems like we have some type of fey or fairy type creature that is being invoked or evoked by the evoker. Going back to this guy, that's not his only attack. He of course has the Fang ability. In-game, these are known as Evocation Fangs. Now, there's really only one animal in-game that actually has a fang that matches what we see in-game, and that's of course the bear. So it's possible that the evoker is sort of evoking some aspect of the bear in its attack. Now, there's one more aspect of the evoker that's really important, however, and that is of course his Totem of Undying. Now, one of the really interesting things about the Totem of Undying for the Evoker is that the Evoker can actually use it. In fact, if you use commands to give an Evoker a Totem of Undying, like you're seeing in this clip, it will actually use it and prevent itself from dying. However, in game, despite the fact that all Evokers have this totem, none of them ever decide to use it. Perhaps this says something about their afterlife and why they would actually choose death or even death in combat rather than escaping death through the use of this totem. But moving forward, we need to talk about the Woodland Mansion. Now, the Woodland Mansion has a ton of different rooms that are going to have an impact on what religious practice seems to be going on with the Illagers. The first room of real importance is going to be the altar room. This room right here is just very interesting. It's a little bit difficult to tell what's going on, but it seems like it could be some form of sacrifice site. This room always spawns with two vindicators and an evoker, and is clearly one of the central worship rooms within the Woodland Mansion. There's additionally these wool statues that we're going to be able to find throughout the mansion. There's the cat and the chicken, of course, which represent some sort of animal, and there's these faces of the illagers as well as this specific one holding a torch that can be found in rooms and stairwells across the entire mansion. This seems to imply that there's some form of both animalistic worship, but also some form of deity that represents a human, as usually you wouldn't find this level of large imagery for a different purpose. There's two other important rooms that I will make note of. The first one is the fake end portal room that you're going to find here in the top left of the screen. Now, I actually don't think this is related to the worship of the Illagers, especially because there's TNT right inside of it. I think this is actually mocking whatever group or religion is tied to the end and the end portal. So I actually don't think this one has a lot to do with the religion practice, but I do think the other room of importance is the mushroom farm that you're going to be able to find growing here, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Next up is the Illager outpost. Now, I don't think there's actually a ton going on here, other than the fact that we should point out the banners, which are found in this place, as well as in raids, and in their little patrols. I don't think it's likely this is meant to be a specific human, but rather a humanoid deity that they are invoking in battle. Next up, we have the armor trims that can be found throughout both the Woodland Mansion and the Pillager outpost. Now, the interesting thing is that pillagers don't use armor, or at least we never see them wearing it, and any armor we find in their loot tables never has these trims on it, which leads me to believe that these aren't actually designed to be armor trims. Rather, the player misuses what is actually a religious rune, and they're using it as an armor trim, and that's not the intended purpose for these things. Now, speaking of armor, there's something really important that we need to address. I will mention this feature is specific to Bedrock Edition, it's not on Java, but if you're fighting Illagers during a raid, they have a chance to drop enchanted iron armor. They don't use it, they don't wear it in-game, but they're carrying it. This implies that while they have armor, they're actually intentionally taking it off before battle. This is going to be really important when I come to my conclusion, so keep that one in mind. So, what real-world religion most closely aligns with what we just discussed and saw within the Illagers of Minecraft? Well, I think it's pretty clear. It's paganism or polytheism. More specifically, Nordic paganism. Starting off with the Evoker, let's look at the attacks. Well, we've already discussed that the Vex are some sort of fae or pixie. We do see something like that in like river spirits or wood spirits within Nordic paganism. Additionally, the fact that the fangs are likely some sort of bear, evoking the spirit of a bear is a significant part of Nordic paganism, especially within what is known as the berserkers or the bear skins. We'll get a little bit more into that later, but both of these attacks do seem to align with something somewhat related to Nordic paganism. Additionally, we have the Totem of Undying for this guy. Now, once again, we discussed that they can use the Totem of Undying, but they choose not to. Why is that? Well, my suspicion is that because if you're using a Totem of Undying, you're not going to get to Valhalla. It's well known among the internet that Nordic pagans who die in battle get to enter a special afterlife known as Valhalla. Now, something that I will point out about Valhalla is it's not as significant as sometimes the internet makes it out to be. It can sort of seem cool and, tough bearded guys talk about Valhalla. But you have to remember that most people who practice this religion didn't die in combat. It would be illness or injury or old age, not combat. But it is still important to note that since the evokers, vindicators, and pillagers are all hostile warriors, this could be more significant in the Illagers than how we see it sometimes in real life practice. Next up, let's talk about the pillager. You see, the pillager has a really interesting name that has a lot to do with its function. Now, of course, pillaging isn't itself religious, but it does actually tie into a religious practice we can find within Nordic paganism. Specifically, what is known in Latin as rapto vivere. Apologies if I said that wrong. This is a Latin phrase meaning to live by plunder or to live on stolen goods. Sometimes it's associated with living in the manner of wolves. Essentially, what you're having in Nordic paganism, almost as a religious coming of age, is there would be times where individuals, males specifically, would go out into the wilderness and live off the land, living by pillaging villages, which of course corresponds directly with what we see in game. So perhaps we have rapto vivere being practiced in the patrols we see and the raids going around the game. Next up, we should discuss the Berserker or the Vindicator. Now, I know the Berserker isn't actually the name of the Vindicator, but there's a lot of overlap here that's certainly worth addressing. In Nordic paganism, berserking actually translates to bear skin. Not like you're naked, but actually like the animal bear. You're invoking almost the spirit of the bear to flow through you. This allows you to enter a trance-like state and would actually frequently result in people taking off their armor before battle. Now, a lot of scholars theorize that this trance-like state was produced by the use of psychedelic mushrooms taken before battle that would numb the senses and make them go crazy and aggressive, which we definitely do see some correlation with what we've seen in the raids and in the mushroom farms that we find in the Woodland mansions. Alright, back to the Woodland mansion. We've already talked about what rooms seem to be important here, but how do they correspond to real life? Well, we actually do see both animalistic totems and more humanoid-shaped totems used in the worship practices, similar to the large wolf statues we see in the Woodland Mansion. We do also see various types of altars. There's one example on the bottom left of how altars are used in Nordic paganism. Altars can take a variety of forms and shapes, so seeing one like the one we do see in the Woodland Mansion isn't super out of place. Additionally, regarding the more humanoid faces we see everywhere, we do have a practice known as god masks, which is where you would almost have a faceplate that looks a little bit like a human. Although I will admit, this isn't that common. Going forward, we have to talk about the armor trims and how I think this really relates to runes. And honestly, if you actually compare them side by side, as far as you can get with a 16 by 16 texture, they actually look pretty similar to a rune, both in the shape and the color and the design. Now, an interesting thing you'll see in the runes that I've selected for the example is a lot of them have crosses. This relates to how largely Christianity ended this religion by converting most of its adherents to Christianity. So that's why you will see a large overlap between some of the Nordic pagan stuff and some of the cross. In fact, most of the history we have regarding Nordic pagans doesn't come from them themselves, but rather the Christians that came after them and recorded their history for them. But there's two problems with all that I've talked about so far. Number one, vegetarianism. If you actually look through every single loot table, every single drop, and every single option, there's no meat anywhere in Illagers' loot tables, chests, or structures. But there is a number of vegetables, and you can actually find multiple different vegetable or fruit farms within the Woodland mansion itself. So, although we can't say for certain, the Illagers might actually be vegans or vegetarians. Additionally, humanoid statues. While we do see some, like the wooden statues you saw earlier, they're not all that common amongst Nordic pagans. We actually see a lot more smaller stuff or animalistic stuff. We don't see large statues like what we see in the sort of woodland mansions. This brings us to our vocab alert. Today's vocab alert, we're going to be talking about syncretism. Now, what is syncretism? Syncretism is essentially when religions combine, mix and match, and sort of syncretize or sync up together. A good example of this is how Islam and Hinduism both sort of meshed in an area in India, and that's largely what created Sikhism today. However, that's not the usual form of syncretism. Syncretism usually takes the form of one religion incorporating smaller elements from another religion, such as Nordic paganism taking something from Greek paganism. We actually do have different examples of that. Now, going forward with syncretism, there's something that we should note. It's much less common among monotheism religions as is polytheism. For instance, it's not that big of a deal for both Thor and Zeus to exist in the same religion. You can simply say one's over a different area or one has different focuses. However, for something like Islam or Christianity, looking at Islam, the central belief is that there is no God but Allah. So you're much less likely to find Nordic paganism or other things taking root in Islam compared to what you would see in polytheism, where you can just say, yeah, there's a whole bunch of different gods. So it's not surprising that we see some degree of syncretism within the Minecraft Illagers. Now, what type of syncretism do we see? Well, going back to the two problems, we have vegetarianism and large statues, which is really common among Greek pagans. So we actually do have a potential idea, and that is Pythagoreanism. Yes, that Pythagorean. Not only was he a math guy, he was a Greek pagan who sort of formed a lot of his own religious ideals. Unsurprisingly, it actually has a lot to do with how math plays with sort of religious ideas, and he sort of associates numbers and gods in some sort of complex way. It's a little bit interesting. I would suggest doing your own research on it, but one thing that we do know is it was common for them to be aesthetic and practice vegetarianism on top of still worshiping the Greek gods. So this might actually answer if these two elements were taken from the Pythagoreans and given to the Nordic pagans. This might actually answer all the problems that we're seeing and actually align really well with the religion of the Illagers. So, let's get into application. And I want to specifically focus on Valhalla, because I think that's where most of the application is going to work. More specifically, how can we kill Illagers while preventing them from reaching Valhalla? Well, there's a couple of different ways that I suspect you can do this. One way that I think is you could give yourself invisibility and strength, and if you're able to kill a villager in one hit, that's not necessarily combat because the illager didn't know you were there and didn't try to fight back in any way. However, perhaps you think that's a little bit too direct. Well, another great option would be simple fall damage. Another option is, well, the illagers build their structures out of wood and I simply have flint and steel. I think these are all great options, and if you guys have other ideas on how to kill illagers in a way that prevents them from going to Valhalla, let me know in the comments. All that being said, it seems like we've firmly established the religion of the Minecraft Illagers. Make sure to subscribe and stick around for the next video where I'm going to be discussing the religion that we find in the end, specifically the dialogue that you get whenever you enter the end portal after killing the dragon.